The next Ju-87D dive bomber variant was nicknamed Dora by its pilots. Its development is usually traced to the spring or summer of 1940, although some historians believe the first design work began even earlier, shortly after the Polish campaign ended in late 1939. That campaign exposed several weaknesses in the earlier variants. The aircraft's rifle-caliber defensive armament was too weak, and German bombers took losses even from outdated Polish PZLP-11 fighters armed with only 2 comparable machine guns. The aircraft needed better armor and improved protection for the crew. The problem was not limited to defense. It also affected the aircraft's offensive role. The 2 forward-firing machine guns in the wings were not effective enough for suppressing anti-aircraft positions protecting ground targets. These shortcomings became clear during the Battle of France and were even more apparent during the Battle of Britain. To address them, engineers began adapting the Ju-87 airframe in the spring of 1940 so it could use the new Jumo 211F and Jumo 211J engines. These engines offered higher output than the earlier power plants thanks to an improved supercharger and a higher compression ratio. They also used a pressurized cooling system that operated at higher pressures. The J model, unlike the F, included an intercooler to cool the compressed air from the supercharger. This allowed it to maintain higher output at maximum RPM. The trade-off was that the more advanced Jumo 211J required high-grade 100-octane aviation fuel, while the simpler Jumo 211F could operate on standard 87-octane avgas. The Jumo 211F produced 1,383 horsepower at takeoff and 1,075 horsepower at altitudes above 13,450 feet. The Jumo 211J had a strengthened crankshaft and direct fuel injection. It produced 1,400 horsepower at takeoff, and at around 14,100 feet, its output rose to 1,410 horsepower. At maximum continuous power and 12,460 feet, it delivered 1,260 horsepower. The first aircraft used to test this new power plant was an experimental prototype converted from a standard production airframe. It first flew in March 1941. The results were mixed. The new engine was heavier and shifted the center of gravity forward, which made ground handling on unpaved airstrips more difficult. At the same time, the larger radiators worsened the aerodynamics of the nose section, so speed and maneuverability improved only slightly. Because of this, the next 3 experimental aircraft were built from revised drawings. These prototypes made their first flights in the spring of 1941. Engineers moved the water and oil radiators again and protected them from below with steel armor. To improve protection for the cooling system and refine the aerodynamics, the radiator flaps were made from 4mm armor plate. The cockpit was also redesigned. The canopy became smoother and more aerodynamic, with a lower rear section. Crew protection was increased as well. The pilot received an armored bulkhead, an 8mm backrest, and a headrest nearly 12mm thick. The rear gunner was given an 8mm backplate and a 5mm floor plate. The rear cockpit glazing was strengthened with 50mm armored glass mounted in a steel frame. The first test aircraft retained the forward-firing MG-17 machine guns, but the planned bomb load was ambitious. Designers intended the aircraft to carry an 1,800-kilogram bomb. For comparison, the standard payload of a Soviet IL-2 was about 600 kilograms. That would have been a very large bomb load for a single-engine aircraft of this type. In practice, however, the landing gear was not strong enough at the early stage of development, so the maximum bomb load had to be limited to 1,000 kilograms. Because the aircraft had become heavier, the landing gear struts also had to be reinforced. The revised design was tested in the fall of 1941. The large wheel spats were reduced in size, and the rigid metal fairings on the struts were replaced with flexible, pleated rubber covers. On one prototype, a tropical equipment package for operations in hot climates was also tested. At the same time, engineers looked for ways to increase the rear gunner's firepower. They first tried a twin mount using standard MG-17 machine guns. Later, they introduced the new 7.92mm MG-81Z twin barrel system with a very high rate of fire. Even so, the aircraft's defense against enemy fighters remained limited. By the middle of the war, many combat aircraft were already using heavy machine guns and autocannons, which reduced the effectiveness of rifle-caliber defensive weapons. In the spring of 1941, German factories began producing the Ju-87D, known as the Dora. It was intended to replace earlier versions on the assembly line. By that point, however, the Stuka had already passed the peak of its wartime career. After earlier operations in Spain, Poland, France, and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe suffered heavy losses in the Battle of Britain. Dive bomber production was reduced sharply. The Dora was seen mainly as an interim solution until a new ground attack aircraft became available. Production figures reflected that decline. The Luftwaffe received 70 of these bombers in January, but only 12 in September and just 2 in November. In total, only 476 airframes were built in 1941, far fewer than in the previous year. Production continued largely because of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The aircraft's early results on the Eastern Front led the German Air Ministry to reverse its earlier decision to end production and place a new order for almost 1,000 aircraft for the 1942 campaign. Starting in late 1941, Ju-87 production increased again. Another major factory in Bremen joined the program, and output nearly doubled the following year. 917 new bombers were built. The weapons on the new production Ju-87s were mounted on updated multi-purpose racks. A typical aircraft could carry a single 1,000-kilogram bomb or a special 1,400-kilogram armor-piercing bomb. On the outer wing hardpoints, crews usually carried a pair of lighter bombs weighing 50 to 70 kilograms. These stations could also take smoke dispensers or cluster munitions. Other loadouts were possible as well. The reinforced centerline rack could carry a 250-kilogram bomb, a 300-liter drop tank, or a gun pod with heavy machine guns or cannons. Several versions of these pods were developed. One mounted 6 forward-firing machine guns. Another angled the barrels slightly downward to improve strafing. A third version carried twin 20mm cannons. Ammunition for these weapons was stored in a magazine directly behind the guns. The updated Ju-87 appeared on the Eastern Front and in North Africa in early 1942. A tropicalized version was produced for desert conditions. Around the same time, another variant was introduced for towing transport gliders. The German High Command wanted to build on the earlier use of glider towing in the Balkans and during the Crete campaign. This tug version differed from the standard aircraft by having a reinforced tail section, stronger landing gear, and a tow hook. At first, these aircraft were used mainly in Africa, but field units later found that standard versions could also be adapted for glider towing with relatively minor changes. As the war continued, the Ju-87's effectiveness as a classic dive bomber came under increasing pressure. Anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition became more dangerous, and the Luftwaffe steadily lost air superiority on several fronts. Together with the battlefield effectiveness of the Soviet Il-2, this pushed the German command to shift the aircraft toward the ground attack role. Pilots had to change their tactics. Steep dive attacks became increasingly risky, so they were ordered to conduct low-level strikes instead. In this role, however, the Ju-87 also suffered heavy losses from ground fire. The Jericho trumpets that had once added a psychological effect early in the war no longer had much practical value, and crews eventually removed them. This led to the Ju-87D3, a more heavily armored ground attack version. It retained dive brakes for steep bombing attacks, but it received additional armor to improve crew protection. The pilot was protected by a 50mm armored glass windscreen. Over the standard side paneling, engineers added chrome nickel-steel plates around 8mm thick. On some aircraft, armor was also added to the sliding canopy sections. Extra armor plates were mounted around the rear gunner's position, including additional protection for the gunner's head. The revised gun mount gave a wider field of fire with traverse of 45 degrees to either side, elevation of 60 degrees, and depression of 15 degrees. Even so, many gunners complained that the new rear cockpit was cramped and harder to enter and leave than that of the earlier B model, which they referred to as the Berta. The aircraft also received an additional 5mm armor plate under the oil cooler, as well as steel protection for the fuel tanks from the front and sides. Its offensive armament remained limited. The Ju-87D3 still carried only 2 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns in the wings. Not until the Ju-87D5 did the aircraft receive 2 20mm MG-151 cannons. During ground attack missions, these aircraft often used wooden dispenser containers loaded with 92 small SC-2 fragmentation bombs weighing 2 kilograms each. In practice, these were of limited value against well-armored targets, so crews relied more on heavier bombs of 250 or 500 kilograms. The Ju-87D3 became the most widely produced Stuka variant, with more than 1,500 aircraft built. Engineers also used this airframe as a basis for several experimental versions. One production aircraft was fitted with the more powerful Jumo 211P engine. This engine had a higher compression ratio and increased RPM, raising takeoff power to 1,500 horsepower. Above 14,000 feet, it still produced 1,410 horsepower. The most important later development was the dedicated anti-tank version fitted with 37mm underwing cannons. This was the aircraft that later became known as the Gustav. Increasing the firepower served several purposes. The Ju-87 was being moved away from the role of a pure dive bomber and toward that of a multi-role ground attack aircraft. It was expected to attack targets not only with bombs but also with cannon fire and to suppress enemy anti-aircraft defenses before the main strike. It was also intended to engage armored vehicles on the battlefield. Of all the variants, the Special Operations version was the most unusual. It was designed to carry saboteurs behind enemy lines. For this purpose, engineers mounted two streamlined two-man pods above the wings, each with small windows. The idea was that during a shallow dive, the pods would detach and descend by automatic parachute. Flight tests were carried out at the Graf Zeppelin Research Institute in Stuttgart. The aircraft's handling with these pods was considered acceptable, but the project did not move beyond the experimental stage. Releasing two large pods at once created a serious risk that they might strike the aircraft and damage the tail section, so the project was abandoned. Soviet aviators used a much simpler method to achieve a similar transport function with the IL-2. Pilot Georgy Beregovoy later recalled a practice used in Mikhail Gromov's Air Army during relocations to new airfields. IL-2 aircraft were used to carry ground crew personnel. A single aircraft could transport 5 extra men. Improvised two-seat passenger compartments were arranged inside the landing gear fairings, with the passengers secured by suspension harnesses. To avoid accidents, the landing gear retraction mechanism was locked. The 5th passenger was usually placed in the rear gunner's position. According to Beregovoy, no serious incidents occurred during these improvised transport flights. The next variant, the Ju-87D4, was intended to be a land-based torpedo bomber. In this version, the dive brakes and Jericho trumpet sirens were removed. The standard centerline bomb rack was replaced by a mount for a single standard 533mm torpedo, weighing almost 1,700 pounds. Although this configuration was tested, the aircraft was never put into production. Its speed and range were both insufficient, and in those areas it could not match purpose-built torpedo bombers such as the He-111H6 and the Ju-88A-17. The project was therefore abandoned and the experimental aircraft were returned to their original configurations. When the German High Command resumed work on an aircraft carrier, interest in carrier-based aviation also returned. Around the same time, and alongside the D4 effort, another variant appeared, the Ju-87E, unofficially nicknamed Emil. This version had folding wings to save space on deck, and its main landing gear could be jettisoned during an emergency ditching, as on the earlier Ju-87C. The aircraft received naval equipment, and its main planned weapon was the LTF-5B torpedo. A production Ju-87D1 served as the basis for the design, with a strengthened airframe and a modified hardpoint to carry the torpedo. At the Naval Aviation Test Centers in Travemünde and Rechlin, the aircraft underwent trials that included catapult launches and the use of rocket-assisted takeoff boosters. In official documents, it was designated simply as the Ju-87D1 torpedo. In 1942, several additional D1 and D3 airframes were included in these tests. As plans for the carrier moved forward, the Weser plant even received an order in 1943 to build 115 production Emils. After the German defeat at Stalingrad in February of that year, however, plans to complete the carrier Graf Zeppelin were effectively dropped and the order was canceled. As with many military aircraft, the Ju-87 became heavier as new equipment, armor, weapons, and fuel were added. Wing loading approached undesirable levels, so engineers introduced the Ju-87D5 in early 1943. Its wingspan was increased to nearly 49 feet, and the wing area rose to 364 square feet. Although the aircraft gained roughly 240 to 265 pounds, the larger wing reduced wing loading and improved takeoff and landing behavior. To increase firepower, the standard MG-17 wing machine guns were replaced with 20mm Mauser MG-151-20 cannons. Their long barrels, together with the extended wings, became one of the easiest ways to identify the D5. Early production aircraft still had dive brakes for steep attacks, but these were later removed, reflecting the continuing shift from dive bombing toward the ground attack mission. Because crews often had to land on rough forward airstrips, the designers also reintroduced jettisonable landing gear, a feature previously associated with carrier-based versions. While the Ju-87D5 was in production, the cockpit was refined further. The main goals were to improve visibility, increase crew protection, and make the aircraft easier to fly during very low-level attacks and later, night bombing missions. Demand remained high, and an order was placed for 1,178 Ju-87D5s. The Lemwerder plant delivered 771 of them, while the Tempelhof facility continued production until early autumn 1944, when Adolf Hitler ordered an end to bomber production. The Ju-87D5 was the last major variant in the family to see service, including occasional use in the dive bomber role. German engineers also proposed a simplified Ju-87D6, but it never left the drawing board. In terms of protection, the armor scheme of the Ju-87D series remained limited. Behind the pilot, there was a single vertical 8mm armor plate. On the sides, bottom, and front, the armor was thinner, only 4mm. The pilot's seat was made of 4mm steel, while the headrest was 10mm thick. Compared with Soviet aviation armor, these plates corresponded approximately to Soviet armor thicknesses of 5.3, 2.8, and 6.6 millimeters. The cockpit windscreen used 60mm armored glass, roughly equivalent to about 43 millimeters of Soviet armored glass. Behind the engine, on both sides of the fuselage, there were two contoured 5mm armor plates, equivalent to about 3 millimeters of Soviet armor. Between them, a small viewing window in the floor allowed the pilot to look downward in flight. If a large bomb was mounted on the centerline rack, however, this view was blocked. Even so, the surrounding armor provided some protection for the pilot and the oil tank. Protection for the rear gunner was also limited. It consisted of an 8mm vertical plate with 5mm side panels, roughly equivalent to 5 and 3 millimeters of Soviet armor. Beneath the gunner's feet was a 5mm armored floor, giving the equivalent of about 3 millimeters. Above, the gunner was covered by a curved armored canopy made up of two 8mm side plates and a 5mm top plate integrated into the roof of the position. The coolant radiators were protected from above and below by flat 4mm armor plates. The front and rear sections were covered by armored shutters of the same thickness. The oil coolers, by contrast, had armor protection only from below, using a 4mm plate built into the engine cowling. The coolant lines were also protected. From the front, they were shielded by 5mm vertical plates located in the leading edge of the wing root, backed by 3 horizontal armor sheets placed underneath the lines. The fuselage fuel tanks were protected against small arms fire and shrapnel by 5mm plates. Altogether, the armor of the Ju-87 weighed around 440 pounds. A closer look at this armor layout shows the design priorities clearly. German engineers tried to provide strong protection to the rear of the crew compartment, but in practice, the concept had clear limits. The gunner's 8mm vertical plate, like the pilot's similar rear bulkhead, could not withstand 20mm armor-piercing fire from the Soviet Shvak cannon, let alone 23mm VIA-23 rounds or heavy 12.7mm armor-piercing ammunition from the UB machine gun. The thinner side and bottom armor, along with the upper protection for the fuel tanks and radiators, was also insufficient against heavier fire and larger fragments. The liquid-cooled engine remained especially vulnerable. In practice, the armor of the Ju-87D could protect the crew and some vital systems only against rifle-caliber fire, and only under favorable conditions. Range had to be at least 400 meters, and the angle of impact had to remain strongly oblique, around 15 to 20 degrees or less. The earlier Ju-87B had even weaker protection. Soviet military engineers produced manuals explaining how their pilots should attack these aircraft. The manuals identified the crew as the most vulnerable target, along with the coolant header tank on the left side of the engine, the coolant radiator, and the fuel pump beneath the engine. Pilots were also advised to aim at the auxiliary oil tank above the engine, another tank behind the firewall in front of the cockpit, and the large wing fuel tanks, which lacked self-sealing protection. The limitations of the rear defensive armament made matters worse for Ju-87 crews. The tail structure restricted the gunner's line of sight and left only a narrow firing sector for the twin MG-81 machine guns. According to captured Luftwaffe gunners, using the flexible mount in combat was difficult. Combat statistics from the Eastern Front between 1943 and 1945 also suggest that the Ju-87D5 had limited effectiveness per sortie in the ground attack role. The probability of destroying a Soviet medium tank was less than 1%, about 0.7%. The figure for a light tank was around 2.4%. For an armored car, it was 13%. For a truck, 22%. For an artillery position, 7%. And for a pontoon crossing, 8%. Heavy losses on the Eastern Front led the Luftwaffe to adopt tactics that had already been used successfully by the Soviet side with the P-02, and earlier the R-5 in the night harassment role. As German ground attack units began receiving FW-190 fighters, Ju-87s that remained serviceable were transferred in increasing numbers to night units. This exposed another problem. At night, the flashes from the engine exhaust stubs seriously affected the pilot's night vision. That made it difficult to find and attack small ground targets in darkness. Beginning in early 1944, the Luftwaffe adapted the D3 and D5 for night operations. A new facility in Hamburg carried out the conversion under the authority of the Reich Air Ministry. Instead of worn engines, these aircraft were fitted with Jumo 211P power plants. Their most visible change was the addition of flame dampers made from heat-resistant steel over the exhaust stubs. These were intended both to conceal the aircraft at night and to preserve the pilot's vision. The converted aircraft received new designations. The D7 was based on the short-wing D3, while the D8 was a long-wing version derived from the D5. On the long-wing aircraft, the 20mm cannons were fitted with conical flash hiders to reduce muzzle flash. All of these aircraft were assigned to the night attack units known as Nachtschlachtgruppen. Their cockpit armor was strengthened and the radio equipment was improved so that ground-based Freya radar operators could guide them through the Egon system. Most of the approximately 300 modified aircraft received improved radios, and some were also equipped with radio compasses and special antennas. They carried IFF systems as well, reducing the risk of friendly anti-aircraft fire. The dive brakes were removed since they were unnecessary for night missions. In the spring of 1944, the first Ju-87 D3 aircraft prepared for this role reached the night units. They were eventually grouped together under Major Rolf Frost. Their first mission in the new role took place on the night of April 3rd near the Italian bridgeheads at Anzio and Nettuno. The results were considered encouraging enough for the High Command to approve the formation of additional night aviation units. By the autumn, 6 night squadrons were operating the aircraft. On November 1, 1944, Germany's night attack force included 445 combat aircraft, of which 285 were Ju-87 Dora variants. By January 1, 1945, the total had declined because of combat losses. These adapted aircraft continued to equip the night attack groups until the spring of 1945. Most of the later D8 variants were built at the Weserflug plants. The exact number produced remains uncertain since factory records were lost in the final phase of the war. It is also worth noting that from the late 1930s onward, German designers had been trying to create a more advanced successor based on the Ju-87. In the second half of 1940, the Reich Air Ministry asked Juncker's engineers to design an entirely new aircraft that could replace the Stuka. The key requirement was better survivability and stronger self-defense against enemy fighters. The first project drew heavily on the transitional D-series, the Dora. On the initial prototype, the landing gear struts were reinforced and fitted with larger wheels. The wingspan and wing area were increased as well. Even so, the Luftwaffe technical branch rejected the project. The military considered its flight characteristics unsatisfactory. This remained true even though the aircraft used the powerful Jumo 213 engine, which produced 1,776 horsepower at takeoff, and still delivered 1,480 horsepower at 18,700 feet. After that setback, the Junkers design team continued the work and turned to a more thoroughly revised version with improved aerodynamics. The wing was redesigned from the beginning with a wider center section. The aircraft retained the inverted gull wing layout, but the outer panels were simplified and the sharp transitions were reduced. It also received retractable landing gear. The landing gear retracted inward and rotated 90 degrees to lie flat in the wing, reducing drag. The fuselage was redesigned as well. In concept, it followed the same general approach as the Soviet IL-2, with major components gathered inside an armored structure. German industry, however, did not have the means to produce large, curved aviation armor sections of this kind, so the new aircraft, designated the Ju-87F or Friedrich, used flat armor plates bolted together. Their thickness ranged from 3 to 12 millimeters. Using a concept already known from the First World War, engineers enclosed the engine, cockpit, fuel, and oil tanks and radiators inside an armored shell. The armored glass was strengthened as well. The windshield reached 57 millimeters and the side windows were increased to 30 millimeters. The aircraft's defensive armament was also strengthened considerably. Instead of a twin 7.92 millimeter machine gun mount, it received a 20 millimeter MG-151 cannon with 250 rounds, paired with a 13 millimeter MG-131 machine gun with 400 rounds. These weapons were installed in a remote-controlled turret operated by the gunner. The mount could traverse 90 degrees to either side, elevate 95 degrees, and depress 15 degrees, giving broad defensive coverage. The maximum bomb load was raised to 2,000 kilograms. At the same time, available evidence suggests that neither this version nor the earlier Dora was normally flown in combat with an 1,800 kilogram bomb. A more typical combat load was a single 1,000 kilogram bomb on the centerline station, together with up to 4 250 kilogram bombs under the wings. When bombs were not required, the aircraft could instead carry a torpedo, special pods, or drop tanks to extend its range. As the airframe grew heavier, the original engines were no longer sufficient. Designers examined other options, including the DB605 and the BMW 801. The DB605 did not provide enough power for an aircraft of this weight, while the BMW 801, though acceptable in performance terms, obstructed the pilot's forward view too much for a dive bomber. The Jumo 213 was therefore selected, producing 1,850 horsepower at takeoff. These changes transformed the aircraft so thoroughly that it was redesignated as the Ju-187. It was presented to the German High Command in early 1942. By then, however, military interest in traditional dive bombers was already declining. The new aircraft's performance was not strong enough to reverse that trend. Even with a 2,000 kilogram external bomb load, it could reach only about 248 miles per hour. Maneuverability also declined. With a full payload, the aircraft required a takeoff run of more than 2,600 feet, which was too long for many forward airstrips. Even the later version of the Jumo 213 with water methanol injection could not change the outcome. It raised top speed only to 261 miles per hour, and the emergency power setting could be used for no more than 5 minutes. Although the aircraft was already becoming outdated, the design team still received a contract in the autumn of 1943 to build a pre-production batch of 10 aircraft for testing. That plan did not go far. Adolf Hitler soon issued a directive ending work on new piston engine bombers. By that point, only 3 complete prototypes and several incomplete airframes had been built. None of them saw combat. The entire pre-production batch was destroyed during a large American air raid on the factory in Bremen.